So why are we here? We're here because, like many of your organizations, institutions, we are constantly asking ourselves, are we doing what we need to be doing to have the most impact, obviously with our limited resources? Are there new partnerships, relationships that we need to think about? And in that journey, I think it's always important to have community champions. And I have to say that I'm also blessed and grateful at the foundation. We have a board of directors and a president and CEO that understand that part of the role that the philanthropic sector can play and that the foundation can play in this community is that we can think out of the box, that we can incubate ideas and programs, that we can look out in the nation and look at best practices, but then take them here and see would they work and how do we take into account our local context. And it involves risk. And I think that that is a role that the foundation, and I know Inez mentioned this in the morning session, some of you have been here with us since 8 o'clock in the morning, having a discussion about what will it take to move this work forward. So we're here today because we want to start that conversation. We want to build a platform where we can come together to start figuring out, we know the issues, how do we start solving them? How do we start connecting with each other? I think, Robin, you mentioned earlier this morning that you didn't even know some of your colleagues in the room. And so that says a lot about what we need to do in this community, relationship building, trust, engagement, and really think out of the box and as to how do we solve the issues that we have today. So I'm very excited. Thank you so much for being here. I know that I've been, this has been a convening that's been planned for months now. I know all of your assistants by name and their numbers and their emails and everything else. So thank you again. We're going to start the conversation with Dr. Ned Murray from the FIU Metropolitan Center, who's going to give us a brief, high-level overview of what is the economic landscape and the challenges that we're facing in our South Florida community.
Good afternoon. My pleasure to be here, and that was just a wonderful video because it does highlight so much of the positive story that's out there, particularly in terms of new businesses, startups, the institutions that are here. We have some incredible institutions here in Miami-Dade and South Florida in general, so we have a lot to work with. I'm going to see if this will work. So as Janice had mentioned, what I'm going to do is provide a quick overview of the economic landscape here in South Florida, and we're quite fortunate actually because, as many of you know, the U.S. Census released its 2016 data last week. So we've been busy crunching those numbers at the Metropolitan Center to begin looking at updates to many of the economic studies we've done in the past, as well as many of the housing studies that we've done, and many of those in collaboration with our friends at the University of Miami, Robin Barkin. So here's the big picture. I want to paint the challenges, then give you some hard data to be able to kind of back to some of this up, and then I'm going to at the end provide the pathway. Where does this all lead? Where are the opportunities for the anchor institutions and the communities that comprise Miami-Dade and Broward and Palm Beach going forward? So here's what the numbers show. We've combined census data with labor statistics. We've done it very quickly over the past week, and no surprise, the pace of the economic recovery here in South Florida, particularly in Miami-Dade, including wage and household income increases, remain slow and lagging behind other metropolitan areas. That also includes GDP, productivity, all the indicators that we look at. The second point being the scale and scope and the persistence of poverty in South Florida is truly compelling and striking. And we can throw out these percentages. I'm going to try to twist it around a little bit to give you the raw numbers on some of this stuff, because I think we hear a lot of percentages over a period of time, but some of the raw numbers are what's really important. Here in Broward and Miami-Dade alone, we have 800,000 people living in poverty. 800,000 people, 260,000 households, half of which are families, a third of which are female-headed households. So there's just the scale and the scope of the poverty issues that we're dealing here in South Florida, and particularly in Miami-Dade, are truly striking, and the challenge is very enormous. Many of you know 2 years ago, with the support of Commissioner Danielle Levine and City, we did the Metropolitan Center did a prosperity study that focused on Miami-Dade, and we began to look at a lot of these numbers, and that has served as the platform for a lot of the analysis that we have done to date, including as we drill down into some of the neighborhoods like Liberty City, and we're starting to take a peek northward into Broward as well, and I'll share some of those numbers with you. But, and the third point, which we've already passed by, is the housing issue, which I'm going to get to later, because we need to really kind of focus on these economic issues, because that really explains why we have such a affordable housing crisis here in South Florida, and particularly here in Miami-Dade. So here are the numbers. These have been updated. We've been tracking data since the recession started back in 2007, and the trough. The trough was somewhere between 2010 and 2011. But this particular table here shows you the quintiles, the household income quintiles here in Miami-Dade, going back to 2007, updated to 2016, and you can see what's been happening. The recovery has not helped at all so far those living anywhere under the highest quintile. And we have a 95-20 ratio of 35.8%. This was going in the opposite direction, as many of you remember when we did this study, prior to 2007. But it's been flipped and going in the wrong direction, and those who have been hit the hardest are obviously, as you can see here, the lowest and the second to the lowest quintiles. A lot of this has to do with the issue of wages. We can look at these wages here, compare Miami-Dade and Broward, looking at 2011, once again, the trough, going forward to 2016. Those numbers you see in the bars going across, the top one is the United States, and the bottom being the state of Florida. And you can see, particularly in Miami-Dade, we're about $2 less hourly at the hourly rate than the nation as a whole. $15.92 compared to $17.81. Not a whole lot of growth there, and that's been driving a lot of the economic woes of the county. And why does this happen? Well, Broward's leading occupations and wages, we'll compare those to Miami-Dade. These are your top 12 or 13 occupations. These employ over 60% of all our workers. And you can see what they make based upon the area median income. The average annual salary for these top 12 occupations is somewhere between $17,000 and $21,000 a year. And then we wonder why we have such a high poverty rate. And I'll get into a little bit in a couple slides ahead. This is the working poor. This is the working poor. Because as we begin to look at certain locations, when we drill down to a Liberty City has a labor participation rate of 74%. The county, 63%. North Lauderdale, labor participation rate also of 75%. Broward County, 65%. Some of your poorest communities have labor participation rates that far exceed county averages, and yet we have concentrations of poverty. Here are Miami-Dade's. Once again, the occupations, they mirror one another. They don't change a whole lot as we go from one border to the next. With the exception of registered nurses and sales reps, all the other leading occupations are down in that 17 to 21,000 a year. And you can see it by the wages. You can see it by the hourly wages. With that, we see the poverty rates still staying very high. We've seen some improvement over the past year, but we're starting to wonder why that is. That may not be necessarily good news, and we can talk about that later. But they did tick down a bit, but you can see, once again, these poverty rates for Broward, well, particularly Miami-Dade County, both in terms of overall poverty and children in poverty, are far in excess of both the United States and the state of Florida. This bar chart, I think, is particularly striking. Once again, we go back to 2007, the beginning of the economic recession. You can see we had a poverty rate here in Miami-Dade of 15.3% back then. We're at 18.3% now. You can see it has dipped. It has dipped a bit in the past year, but this is in spite of record employment. We are now at record employment here in Miami-Dade. Record employment, Broward County as well. More jobs than ever, over 1.1 million jobs here in Miami-Dade are in existence, but yet we have this persistent poverty rate. And if we start to drill down a bit, down into some of these neighborhoods that we're going to talk about in a minute, we see poverty rates upwards of 40, 45%. Opelika, 44%. Florida City, 45%. These are poverty rates. North Miami, 25%. North Lauderdale, 24%. Okay? These are the maps that many of you saw 2 years ago. Prosperity study funded, once again, by city. It's supported by Commissioner Levine. These 2 years ago, when we began to do this study, the first task was to begin to go back and look at, well, what was happening in Miami-Dade in 2000 and compare it to 2014 at the time of the study. We've been updating a little bit, and we've been, like I said, peaking northward into Broward and even into Palm Beach. And as you can see that, for those of you who have not seen this before, this is the overall poverty rate from between 2000 and 2014. You can see it actually got worse. It actually got worse in what we defined back then as this whole spine of distress, the spine of distress that extended from Miami Gardens southward all the way down to Florida City, essentially along the I-95 corridor and Federal Highway to the south. If you take this north into Broward County, Dixie Highway to the east, Old State Road 7 to the west, you find many of the same economic conditions. Not just economic conditions, but socioeconomic stress that exists in many of these communities. I mentioned Lauderdale Lakes. North Lauderdale Lakes is also part of that as well. This is the children in poverty. This one, once again, 2000 to the left, 2014 to the right. Based upon the data that we're looking at right now, even though the overall poverty rate has dipped a bit since last year, the poverty rates in many of these areas where we have these persistent concentrations of poverty have remained unaltered, despite the fact you have upwards of 70, 74% labor participation rates in these neighborhoods. Liberty City is a particular interesting one. We did a study working with our colleagues at UM that focused in on Liberty City. If you took Liberty City and created a trade area around it so that Liberty City would be the bullseye, Liberty City would be the second largest trade area in the state of Florida. But this disconnect and inequality, that's what's really striking here. The fact that you could have these kind of statistics relative to Liberty City and yet have these poverty rates, not only in Liberty City, but as I mentioned, Opelika and all the way down to Florida City. It's a real disconnect, and fundamental, because it's not just the poverty rates, it's the issues relative to educational attainment, health, okay? So, where does this take us? It takes us to the issue of housing. It kind of explains a lot, right? Now that we begin to talk about housing, I'm not going to throw out a lot of these numbers, but we're not even focused anymore on so much the level of cost burden. We're more focused now on the level of severely cost burden. Because if you're just cost burden at 30%, you're probably lucky. If you're cost burden at 40%, you're probably in the minority. It's the cost burden, it's the severely cost burden. Those renters pay in excess of 50% of their income on housing costs, and then when added to transportation costs, you're looking at cost burden percentages that far exceed any place else in the country. In fact, Miami is now the most unaffordable rental housing market in the country. And so we're looking at, from the stress perspective is looking at where people are now in terms of their, because we want to focus on residual income, right? What money you have left to pay for food and health and clothing for your children. Well, look at this disparity. These are the existing rents in many locations, and we benchmarked this against other locations like Tampa and Orlando, and you can see here that the existing rents and the asking rents, there's just this huge gap. So people are essentially stuck in place. There's no mobility in this rental market. Then when we look at residual income, we see that in many of these communities, and you can see Hialeah and Opelika and Homestead at the bottom, the gap is so large that they're underwater, which means that folks just aren't making it. So they're making difficult decisions every day in terms of how they're going to pay the rent and what they're not going to pay for, including food, medicine, things like that. So that was a critical finding, and we know what that means. It means shrinking contributions to savings and retirement, tough choices, as I mentioned, between food and medical bills, different living arrangements. We know there's a lot of that going on, and of course, renters living paycheck to paycheck. And we know that the homeless situation is increasing not only here but nationwide. So the path forward, what are the conclusions? Well, once again, the scale and scope of Florida's economic distress cannot be addressed by conventional community and economic development thinking. We have to think outside the box. We have to get back to the fundamentals. As Janice mentioned, we really need to define what community development is and what it's not, okay? The second, we need to change the discussion about housing affordability. We need to talk about it in more economic terms. The economic impact, what does that mean in terms of South Florida's competitiveness? What does it mean for the quality of life of our residents and our workers if they're having to worry about every dollar they earn? It's just not sustainable. And then the last, which I guess is really the key path forward in terms of the afternoon session, is this finding that actually came out in the prosperity study that we did 2 years ago, but didn't get as much ink, is that we need a new community development institutional framework with a long-term commitment to community investment and human development. This is fundamental community development. We're not there yet, but we can, because we have the institutions that are here, we have the resources out in the community, but it's not going to happen this year, it's not going to happen next year. We're talking at least a 10-year type of investment, and we need to figure out how we're going to do that. Who are the anchor institutions? What are their roles and responsibilities? Who are the other resources? Because this is not going to happen from the federal government. It's not going to happen based on state funds. Those are Band-Aids. They've been Band-Aids for a long time. And that Band-Aid's been getting smaller and smaller each year anyways. But these are major, major systematic issues, fundamental issues that can only be addressed if we put forward a real, vibrant, and dynamic community development infrastructure. So with that, I leave you. Thank you.